The first thing that struck him wasn't the horizon, though the evening sky bled red like a battlefield set ablaze. It was her, a lone figure in what had once been a white dress, now torn to rags, her wrists bound cruelly with rope. Her face was smeared with dust and streaked with blood, her body carved with welts so deep they seemed to reach her bones. The desert wind pulled at her hair, but her eyes were lifeless, hollow caverns that told the truth. Her spirit had already drifted far from her body. Now ask yourself, what would you have done if that vision stood before you? A stranger who no longer begged for rescue, only for the release of death. Would you have turned your back, telling yourself it was not your war to fight? Or would you have stepped closer, knowing that in freeing her you might chain yourself to every burden she carried? Out there, the desert gave no counsel. It only whispered its silence. It was the year 1885, in the desolate heart of Big Bend Country, Texas. A land where law traveled slowly, and cruelty moved like a rattlesnake, quick and merciless. Men carved their own justice, and the frail were often abandoned to die under the weight of the sun. Elias Thorne, a cattleman of 48, had known loss too well. 6 years earlier, he had lowered his wife Mary into the earth with his own hands. Since that day, he had lived in solitude, working his herd, swallowing black coffee, and carrying his memories like stones in his pockets. He thought he had measured all the ways a man could be broken. But the sight of her told him he had been wrong. She raised her head just enough to look at him, her lips cracked, her voice little more than a whisper riding the wind. "Kill me." That was all. No pleading, no tears, no spark of resistance. It wasn't a request, it was surrender. She wasn't asking for mercy. She was asking for finality. Elias froze, the echo of her words rattling loose memories long buried. He had heard death speak before, on battlefields, in sick rooms, in the hushed hours of men too tired to fight another dawn. But never like this. Never from someone so young. She stood wrapped in a ruined garment, the color of innocence long gone, her body trembling but her eyes still fixed on him. Slowly, he drew the knife from his belt, the blade catching the last fire of the setting sun. For an instant, she seemed certain he would grant her wish. But instead, he crouched and cut through the rawhide biting into her wrists. The rope fell away, and she slumped forward, weightless as dry timber, collapsing into his arms. From her tattered dress something slipped, an envelope, crumpled and blood-stained, its wax seal broken long ago. Elias caught it before it touched the ground. He turned it in his rough hands but did not break it open. There would be a time for that. For now, the only truth that mattered was the faint, uneven breath still rattling in her chest. He lifted her carefully and settled her onto his horse. The gelding shifted under the unfamiliar weight, but Elias steadied both beast and girl. The desert stretched endlessly around him, harsh and indifferent. The ride to his ranch would take hours, and the night had already begun its slow descent. Still, one thing was certain, he would not abandon her to die in the dust. Not dressed in rags. Not carrying those scars. Not with her last words carved into his memory. As he swung into the saddle and turned toward home, the final blaze of daylight slipped behind the ridgeline, leaving only darkness to spread across the land. Questions pressed in from every side. Who had done this to her? What cruelty had carved such marks into her flesh? And what truth hid inside that blood-stained letter, waiting to be read? This was no simple rescue. It was the start of a reckoning. Anyone who bore witness knew there was no walking away. The trail ahead had to be followed, for whatever truth lay inside that letter would shatter the silence of the frontier. The journey home was slow, the weight of exhaustion heavy on both rider and horse. The girl barely stirred, her head resting against Elias as though she drifted between two worlds. When he finally laid her on the bed inside his cabin, the bed Mary once kept beneath the window, she seemed more ghost than flesh. Elias fetched water from the well, wiped the dust and blood from her skin, and bound her wounds with strips of cloth. He asked no questions. Silence, he knew, often carried more meaning than words. Many men would have left her where she lay, told themselves her suffering was not theirs to bear. But Elias remained. And you may ask yourself again, would you have done the same? Her dress, little more than shreds, clung to her like a memory too painful to release. Elias went to the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Inside lay garments folded untouched for years, Mary's dresses, pale blue and plain, untouched since the day she was buried. His hands lingered on the fabric, rough and hesitant, as though even touching it betrayed the past. But in the end, he carried one to the chair beside the bed. If the girl opened her eyes again, she would not wake to rags. Elias took his place at the table, the lantern throwing long shadows against the log walls. His eyes wandered to the letter lying beside him, the paper stiff with blood, the broken wax seal a silent warning. He had not opened it. Not yet. A man did not run headlong into the storm when he already knew it was waiting. Through the night he listened to her breathing, ragged, faltering, yet steady enough to promise she still clung to life. He thought of Mary, of the nights she would hum softly before sleep, and realized this girl had done the same before drifting into unconsciousness. The tune was shattered, barely audible, but it was there. And in that sound, something shifted. That was the moment the story tightened its grip, drawing Elias into a path he had not chosen. Because the letter on the table was more than a scrap of paper. It was the key to everything: why she was broken, who had done this, and how far the ripples of her suffering would spread. And when its truth finally came to light, it would tear through the stillness of the West like a storm no man could outride. The girl wasn't just some half-dead soul dragged out of the dirt. She carried something heavier than scars, knowledge that tied her life to men whose cruelty reached farther than Elias could yet picture. She barely stirred through the following day, her chest rising slow, each breath a small battle. By dusk, Elias knew the walls of that abandoned ranch house wouldn't hold her forever. She needed medicine, food that didn't taste like dust and jerky, and clothes that weren't haunted by the memories of strangers. That left him one choice: a trip into Alpine. He saddled the horse, settled her carefully into the wagon, and wrapped her in a shawl. She sat quiet, eyes flicking around as though shadows themselves carried knives. When the wagon rolled down the main street, the town hummed with its usual noise: boots on wood planks, voices spilling from the saloon, wagons clattering over dirt. Elias drove them straight to the general store. Inside, the routine felt almost ordinary. He bartered for flour, salt, cloth, and bandages. The shopkeeper gave him nothing but a nod. But trouble never bothered with doors. It waited outside. Leaning against the hitching post was a man Elias had no trouble placing: Caleb. In town they called him a ranch hand, but Elias had met his kind in back alleys and battlefield camps, men who fed on meanness for its own sake. Caleb's smile cut wide when his eyes landed on the girl. "Well, look here," he drawled, stepping forward. "Figured you'd been buried by now. Guess the boys didn't finish their work." The girl froze, her hand clawing tighter into Elias's sleeve. Caleb reached as if to tear away her shawl. Elias moved before thought had time to catch up. His fist cracked across Caleb's jaw, sending the man reeling and spitting blood. The crowd gasped. Caleb's hand shot for his gun, but Elias already had his revolver drawn, leveled dead steady. His voice came low, sharp as a blade. "Touch her again, and you won't draw another breath." For a heartbeat the whole street was stone still. Then Caleb's hand dropped, though fury burned hot across his face. "This ain't finished," he hissed, teeth red. "The camp will come for her. She's ours." He spat dust, stumbling off while eyes followed. The crowd thinned, whispers trailing in their wake, some heavy with fear, some edged with respect. The girl said nothing, but when Elias helped her back into the wagon, her eyes caught his. Not hope, not yet, but the faintest flicker that maybe she wasn't walking through hell alone anymore. The ride back was hushed, the sun sinking behind ridges, painting the land in dying firelight. Elias kept his hands steady on the reins, though inside burned a heat he hadn't felt in years. Caleb's warning was no bluff. Men like him remembered insults the way wolves remembered blood. They would come. And Elias would be waiting. Because out here, every time a man stood for what was right, someone had to pay the price. By nightfall, the ranch lay under a silence that didn't belong. The wind threaded low through the mesquite, carrying whispers only men who'd lived long with danger could hear. Inside, the girl sat by a lantern, pale but sharper now, her eyes locked on the flame as though it held her soul together. Elias checked the doors, the rifle by the window, then stepped out onto the porch. Above him, stars spread across the sky like spilled salt. He didn't need to see them yet. He already knew riders were coming. The hooves came soon enough. 3 shadows cutting through the dark, horses restless under them. They stopped just short of the porch. Caleb wasn't there, but his venom lived in their voices. "You've got something that's ours," one called. Elias leaned casual against the post, like the only thing on his mind was the weather. "Only things here are cattle and a roof that leaks." The men shifted. Another spoke, harder. "She was branded. She was judged. You give her up or we'll take her." The silence stretched, thick as tar. Then Elias stepped down, slow and deliberate, lantern in hand. His walk carried the weight of finality, the kind that made a man wonder if this was the last mistake he'd ever make. He didn't head toward the house but toward the shed by the barn. The hinges groaned as he pulled the door open. The smell of dust and rusted iron spilled out. In the corner sat an old crate from the war, its wood dark, letters stenciled faint but clear. "Explosives." Elias set the lantern on top, the light licking over the warning marks. He turned back to the riders, eyes as cold as steel drawn fresh from a forge. "You tell Caleb this ground is off limits," he said. "Or the next time you ride in, you'll leave with the sky burning behind you." The night held its breath. The riders said nothing. Even their horses pawed the dirt uneasily. Elias didn't flinch, didn't blink. Out here, there was no room for second chances. Elias didn't flinch. "I take one more step and this lantern drops. None of us walks away," he said, his voice flat but sharp as steel. The horses pawed at the dirt, restless, sensing the weight in the air. One of the riders muttered a curse under his breath, tugging at the reins. Finally, their leader leaned forward in the saddle. "This ain't over," he spat, eyes narrowed. "You can't keep this up forever." Elias held his ground, the lantern steady in his grip, not a tremor in his hand. He didn't need to shout or wave the flame. The message was written clear in the stillness of his stance. One after another, the riders turned, fading into the black edges of the desert until the only sound left was the distant thud of hooves swallowed by the night. Only then did Elias breathe out, lowering the lantern and walking back to the porch. Inside, the girl hadn't moved. But when their eyes met, she gave the slightest nod. Not thanks, not trust, not yet. But something close to it. A recognition that maybe, just maybe, he would not let her fall. Elias placed the lantern back on the table, his fingers brushing against the unopened letter beside it. He knew men like Caleb didn't forget, didn't forgive. The fight would come back around. But tonight? Tonight the ranch still stood. The girl still drew breath. And once more, the desert belonged only to the crickets and the whisper of wind. Out here, folks didn't always remember the gunshots. They remembered the nights when one man drew his line in the sand and dared the world to cross. Morning slid in gentle, golden. From the outside, nothing had changed. The fences leaned where they always had, the barns sagged against the same hills, and the desert stretched endless in every direction. But inside that small house, something had shifted. Elias could feel it. He had not just lived through the night, he had won something worth keeping. The girl, her name, he soon learned, was Marin, began to find her footing again. At first, she barely spoke, her words frail, but strength crept back little by little. She poured coffee in the mornings, kept the stove burning, even planted sage by the window where Mary once kept her herbs. Tiny gestures, but to Elias, they were milestones. Proof that she was stepping back into life. And maybe proof that he could too. He never asked about the camp or what had been done to her. A man who knows grief understands not to dig around in another's wounds. Instead, he walked her through the land, the cattle drifting slow in the pasture, the Rio Grande cutting its way across stone, the mountains glowing red in the dusk. In that silence, something fragile began to take root. Not a silence heavy with pain anymore, but one edged with peace. Then one evening, Elias froze in the doorway. Marin was singing. The tune was soft, almost hesitant, but whole, stronger than she had been. Not broken. It wasn't Mary's song, not quite, but it carried the same kind of warmth, the kind that seeped into a man's bones. Elias stood there listening, not daring to break the spell. That sound meant hope had returned, that healing had finally begun. Folks out here didn't speak much of love. Words were too small for it. But it was there. In the way Elias tossed an extra log on the fire at night. In the way Maren carefully folded her one blue dress before bed. It lived in the quiet, where words couldn't go. One night, after Maren had drifted into sleep, Elias finally picked up the letter. The one he had carried since the day he found her. The paper was stiff, brittle with dried blood, the seal long broken. He unfolded it carefully, letting the lantern light spill across the words. What he read wasn't just confession. It was evidence. Names, dates, places. A web of men tied to the camp, proving what Maren had endured was just a piece of something much bigger, something stretching far beyond this lonely patch of desert. Elias sat a long time with the paper heavy in his calloused hands. Then, with quiet resolve, he pulled out an envelope, scribbled a few lines, and sealed the damning words inside. By morning, a rider would carry it north to the sheriff in Alpine. Elias didn't sign his name. Some battles are fought out loud with bullets. Others are waged in silence, leaving hope to carry justice through the cracks. Out here, love wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was the steady choice to stay, to protect, to hold the line for someone who couldn't stand on their own. And maybe that's the truth this tale leaves behind. Even in a land as cruel and unforgiving as the West, kindness still carried weight. Sometimes the boldest stand a man could make wasn't with a gun, but with the decision to care. And now I'll put the question to you. If you were in Elias's boots, would you have done the same? Would you have pulled her from the dirt, stood down armed riders in the dark, and opened your home to a stranger? Or would you have turned away, telling yourself it wasn't your fight? If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you that even in the hardest of times there's a spark worth guarding, let it live on. Give it a like, share it so others may find it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next ride through the Wild West. These aren't just tales of dust and gun smoke. They are lessons about standing tall when the world tries to push you down. Because in the end, what gives a story its life is not the fight, but what it shows us about ourselves.